Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Yvan Keller and the quiet streets of Mulhouse. Imagine, if you will, the twilight of the 1980s in the Alsace region of France. The city of Mulhouse, nestled where the borders of Germany and Switzerland breathe against the French frontier, is a place of winding alleys and stone facades. It is a city that remembers its industrial strength, the smoke of the potash mines, and the hum of the textile mills. But in the late 1980s, it was a city settling into a gentle, perhaps deceptive, peace. The air in the Alsace is different. It carries the weight of history in every breeze that rustles through the vineyards on the outskirts of town. Here, the transitions of time feel slower, and the stone buildings seem to hold their breath as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. The year is 1989. It is August, specifically the 4th of August, and the air is thick with the scent of late summer blooms and the cooling dampness of the River Ill. The sun sets slowly, casting long, amber fingers across the terracotta rooftops. In this time, the world felt smaller, more connected by neighborhood ties and less by the digital screens of the future. Doors were often left unlocked during the day, and the click of a skeleton key in a heavy wooden door was a sound of comfort, not of caution. The elderly residents, those who had seen the city through decades of change, moved with a slow, rhythmic grace through their daily chores. They felt safe in the familiarity of their surroundings, in the predictable chime of the church bells, and in the polite nods of the people they passed on their way to the market. There was a profound sense of trust that permeated the air like the smell of fresh bread. Imagine the Rue de Verdun. It is a street lined with bourgeois houses, their gardens lush with hydrangea and carefully manicured hedges. This is a place where nature is brought to heel by the steady hands of those who appreciate order. In August of 1989, a man named Yvan Keller returned to these streets. He did not arrive with a fanfare or a warning. He was simply a man, 28 years of age, newly released from the confines of a prison cell after serving 6.5 years for his youthful transgressions. To the casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd, a son of the region with roots in the mining town of Wittenheim. He was a man who knew the value of hard work and the silence of the earth, having grown up in a family of 9 children where survival was a daily lesson. He moved into an apartment on this quiet, green street, blending perfectly into the background of a peaceful life. Yvan was a landscaper by trade, a man who understood the geometry of a garden and the way a house sits within its landscape. He started a small business which he named Alsa Jardin. Think of the irony in that name, a name that suggests life, growth, and the beauty of the Alsatian soil. He would walk the streets with his tools, his eyes scanning the windows and the doorways of the grand houses. He was helpful. He was polite. He was the kind of man a neighbor would trust to trim the roses or clear the weeds from a path. And as he worked, he listened. He listened to the silence of the houses where the elderly lived alone, their lives governed by the ticking of grandfather clocks and the predictable patterns of age. He became a familiar sight, the friendly gardener who was always ready with a kind word, a man who seemed to belong to the very soil he tended with such apparent care. The atmosphere in Mulhouse was one of profound quiet. In the evenings, the streets would empty, leaving only the soft glow of the lamps to illuminate the cobblestones. There was no sense of an impending storm, no feeling that a predator was moving among them. The police were not patrolling for monsters because, in their eyes, there were none. In this region, a death in the night was often seen as a natural conclusion to a long and storied life. If a woman was found still and cold in her bed, it was a moment for mourning, but rarely for suspicion. The tragedy of the crimes we are about to explore lies in this very silence. The predator did not break windows. He did not leave a trail of chaos or blood. He moved like a shadow, blending into the very gardens he tended, using the trust he had cultivated to gain entry into the most private of spaces. He was a ghost in the twilight. As we settle into this story, feel the weight of the blankets on your own bed. Imagine the meticulous care of a man who would not only take a life, but would then pause to remake the bed, smoothing the sheets until they were taut and perfect. This was his signature, a terrifying display of calm that defied the logic of violence. He wanted the world to see peace where there had been a struggle. He wanted the families to walk in and believe their loved ones had simply drifted away in their sleep, perhaps dreaming of their youth. This meticulousness, this absolute lack of evidence, is what allowed the darkness to persist for over 15 years. It was a crime of silence, committed by a man who looked like any other neighbor, a man who knew exactly how to make a bed look as though no one had ever been disturbed. He was the master of a peaceful facade, hiding a void that no one could see. Tonight, we are standing at the very beginning of this long and narrow path. The sun has dipped below the horizon in 1989, and the first shadows are stretching out from the Rue de Verdun. The streets of Mulhouse are quiet, but the air is changing. There is a chill that has nothing to do with the night breeze and everything to do with the presence of a man who has just stepped back into the world. As we move forward into the details of Yvan Keller's life and his long trail of silent rooms, remember the stillness of the city. We are here to witness the stories that the silence tried to hide, to listen to the whispers that were ignored for far too long. Let your mind drift back to that summer evening, the smell of the damp earth, and the sound of a lone bicycle clicking down a distant lane. The night has begun, and the story is just beginning to unfold in the shadows. The winter of 1989 held the village of Battenheim in a grip of bone-deep cold. In the quiet corners of Alsace, the trees stood like skeletal sentinels against a sky heavy with the promise of snow. Inside the small, tidy home of Marie-Anne Ribert, the air was still, save for the rhythmic, steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Marie-Anne was 82 years old, a woman whose life was measured in the gentle rituals of her garden and the soft light of her reading lamp. That January evening, the frost had begun to crawl across her window panes, delicate and intricate, mirroring the lace doilies on her tables. She lived a full life, feeling only the comforting exhaustion of a day well spent. She moved slowly through her home, a space filled with the accumulated memories of 8 decades. Every object had its place. The ceramic teapot on the stove, the silver-framed photographs of distant relatives, the heavy wool blankets folded at the foot of her bed. To an outsider, it was a picture of perfect, fragile peace. But outside, moving through the darkness with a predator's grace, was a man who saw this peace not as a virtue, but as an opportunity. Yvan Keller was a man of the shadows, a former locksmith who knew the intimate geography of these houses. He understood how a door could be bypassed without a sound, and how the vulnerability of the elderly could be exploited with terrifying efficiency. He did not come with violence. He came with a quiet, calculated intent. When he finally entered the house, the silence did not break. It merely shifted. He moved through the rooms like a breath of cold air, his presence as invisible as the draft under a door. Marie-Anne Ribert was already asleep, her breathing shallow and steady beneath the weight of her quilts. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint, silver glow of the moon filtering through the frost. Keller stood by her bedside for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest. There was no anger in his movements, only a cold, mechanical precision. He had brought with him a simple tool, an object found in every home, yet in his hands it became an instrument of finality. He reached for a pillow, soft and unremarkable, the only thing between life and silence. The pressure was gradual. It was a slow, deliberate drowning in the fabric of her own bed. Marie-Anne, in her 82nd year, did not have the strength to fight the weight of the man or the suffocating silence of the down-filled casing. There was no shattered glass, no upturned furniture, and no cries for help that reached the neighbors in the frost-covered street outside. In those final moments, the boundary between sleep and death became a thin, blurred line. Keller watched as the struggle ceased, his hands steady, his pulse likely as calm as the winter night. When it was over, the room returned to its previous state of absolute stillness. The only difference was that the heart that had beaten for over 8 decades had finally come to a stop, forced into its final, quiet rest by a stranger's hand. But it was what Keller did next that truly defined his dark legacy. He did not flee into the night immediately. Instead, he stayed. He moved with the carefulness of a loving relative, smoothing the sheets and plumping the pillows. He arranged Marie-Anne's body so that she lay on her back, her hands resting naturally by her sides, as if she were merely caught in a deep, dreamless slumber. He tucked the corners of the heavy wool blankets back into place, ensuring every crease was removed and every fold was symmetrical. This was his signature, the perfect bed. He wanted the world to see a natural departure, a peaceful passing of an elderly woman in the middle of a cold January night. By erasing the evidence of his presence, he was also erasing the crime itself, leaving behind a scene that looked like nothing more than an inevitable conclusion. When Marie-Anne Rebert was discovered the following morning, there was no alarm and no sirens. The doctor who arrived to pronounce her dead saw exactly what Keller intended. He saw an 82-year-old woman who had passed away quietly in her sleep during the harshest month of the year. There were no bruises that caught the eye, no signs of a struggle on the pristine bedding. To the medical professional, it was a clear case of heart failure, a natural end for someone of her age. A burial permit was issued without hesitation. The local authorities saw no reason to investigate, no reason to doubt the peacefulness of the scene. In the official records of 1989, Marie-Anne's death was a footnote of natural causes, a silent departure that whispered nothing of the monster who had stood over her bed. The first shadow had fallen, and no one even knew the light had been blocked. In the quiet corridors of the French countryside, there is a certain rhythm to the end of a long life. It is often expected, even embraced as a gentle closing of a book. When an elderly woman, perhaps 92 years old, does not wake in the morning, the village does not whisper of foul play. Instead, they speak of a life well lived, of a heart that simply grew tired after decades of beating. This was the cloak that Yvan Keller used to shield himself. He did not arrive with the crash of broken glass or the heavy tread of a thief. He was something far more unsettling. He was a master of the invisible. To understand his crimes, we must first understand the concept of the White Death. In the medical world of the late 1980s and early 1990s, a White Death was a peaceful passing, one that left no bruises, no broken skin, and no immediate questions for a busy local doctor. Keller took this natural occurrence and turned it into a weapon of silence. Imagine the stillness of a home in the small hours of the morning. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of old wood and dried lavender. Somewhere in the corner of the room, a grandfather clock ticks with a heavy, rhythmic pulse. To anyone else, the house is a sanctuary, a locked box of memories. But to Keller, a man who spent his days as a landscape gardener tending to the gardens of the wealthy and the aged, these houses were familiar terrain. He knew the squeak of a particular gate and the exact shadow cast by a sprawling oak tree in the garden. He moved through these spaces with a terrifying fluidness. He was not a stranger entering a foreign land. He was a phantom returning to a place he had already mapped in his mind. He would find a window left slightly ajar for the summer breeze, or perhaps he had noted where a key was hidden beneath a ceramic pot. Once inside, he did not rush. He existed in the spaces between the ticks of the clock. Forensics is a science of contact, a study of the traces one person leaves upon another. We look for the stray fiber, the drop of blood, the frantic scratch marks of a struggle. But Keller left nothing. As he stood over the beds of women like Marie Winterholer or Ernestine Mang, he was careful to remain a ghost. He would use a pillow, or sometimes simply his hands, to press the life out of his victims. It was a slow process, one that required a chilling level of patience. There was no sudden violence, no outcry that would alert a neighbor. He waited for the struggle to fade into a final, heavy stillness. And when the heart finally stopped, he did not flee. This is where his meticulous nature became truly ghoulish. He would take the time to smooth the sheets, to adjust the pillow, and to tuck the blankets around the body so perfectly that it looked as if the person had merely drifted off while dreaming of their youth. He was creating a scene of absolute peace to hide an act of absolute cruelty. This perfection was his most successful disguise. When family members or doctors arrived later that morning, they saw exactly what they expected to see. They saw an elderly woman resting, her bedsheets crisp and undisturbed. In fact, they were often too undisturbed. For the son of Ernestine Mang, who found his mother in March of 1994, it was the very neatness of the bed that felt wrong. His mother was 86 years old and struggled with mobility. She could not have made a bed with such precision from the inside. Yet, the doctors, seeing no signs of a break-in and no marks on the body, were quick to sign the death certificates. They would write down cardiac arrest or natural causes. They were looking for a murderer who left a mess, but Keller left a masterpiece of domestic order. In the eyes of the law, these deaths didn't even exist as crimes. They were simply quiet departures in a quiet corner of the world. Because there was no blood and no obvious robbery in those early days, the police files remained empty. Statistically, Yvan Keller was invisible. He could commit 40, 50, or perhaps even 150 murders because he was operating in the blind spot of society. We tend to focus on the loud tragedies, the crimes that scream for our attention. We overlook the silent ones. Keller thrived in that silence for over 15 years. He would take small things, a bank card, a bit of jewelry, or a few thousand francs, but he was careful not to disturb the overall aura of the room. He once even moved a heavy butter churn from a cellar to the main floor, a small detail that haunted the victim's family, yet meant nothing to the investigators at the time. He was a shadow moving through the village, a man who understood that if you do not leave a mark, the world will eventually convince itself that you were never there at all. The invisible intruder had no face, no name, and most importantly, no victims that the state recognized as murdered. He was simply the wind that blew through an open window, leaving nothing but a coldness that wouldn't go away. The stillness that follows a death is often heavy, but in the small, lace-curtained homes of Mulhouse and the surrounding villages of Alsace, that silence began to feel different. It was not the hollow, echoing quiet of a life naturally reaching its end. Instead, it was a silence that felt curated. When the family of 77-year-old Augusta Wasmer entered her home in 1994, they found her lying in her bed. Everything was in its place. The sheets were pulled tight, the pillows were plumped with a precision that felt almost professional, and Augusta herself looked as though she had simply closed her eyes and drifted away. The medical examiner, glancing at her age and the peaceful state of the room, noted it as a cardiac arrest. Perhaps, he suggested, it was just the heart giving out under the weight of years. But for those who knew Augusta, there was a discordant note in the air, a faint, metallic vibration that suggested something was very wrong. Augusta's daughter, Marie Francoise, noticed it first. It wasn't a drop of blood or a broken window. It was the bed. It was too well made. Her mother, like many women of her generation, took pride in her home, but this was something else. The tuck of the blankets was immaculate, a surgical neatness that Augusta, in her final moments, surely could not have achieved. And then, there were the missing fragments. A house key, usually kept in a familiar spot, was gone. A bank card had vanished from its drawer. These were not the things a dying woman misplaces in her final hour. When the bank card was used later that day to make 3 separate withdrawals in the center of Mulhouse, the suspicion should have turned into a scream. Yet, when the family spoke to the authorities, the response was a weary shrug of the shoulders. To the police, a missing key was a lapse in memory. To the doctors, a bank card used after death was a matter for the bank, not the morgue. The official narrative remained unshakable. Natural causes. A few weeks earlier, in March of 1994, a similar ghost had moved through the home of 86-year-old Ernestine Mang. Her son, Germain, found her in the same position, lying on her back, the bedclothes smoothed out with that same eerie, haunting perfection. As he stood in the quiet of his mother's house, his eyes caught on something that made the hair on his arms stand up. In the middle of the main floor sat an antique butter churn. It was a heavy, awkward object made of wood and iron, something that had been kept for years in the darkness of the basement. His mother was frail. She could barely navigate the stairs on her own, let alone carry a heavy piece of agricultural history up from the depths of the cellar. Why was it there? Why had it been moved? It sat there like a silent witness, a nonsensical clue left by a visitor who had no fear of being caught. Germain took his concerns to the investigators. He pointed to the butter churn. He pointed to the immaculate bed. He spoke of the impossible physical labor required to move that heavy wood. But the authorities looked at the death certificate and saw the age of the victim. 86. To the state, 86 is an age where the heart is expected to stop. They did not want to hear about antique churns or the texture of the linen. They dismissed the family's intuition as the byproduct of grief, a desperate attempt to find a villain where there was only the natural passage of time. This was the wall that the families hit over and over again. It was a wall built of statistics and ageism. Because Yvan Keller chose victims who were already standing at the threshold of the end, the police felt no need to investigate why they had been pushed through the door. Imagine the quiet frustration of those families. You know your mother's habits. You know the exact way she turns her keys in the lock, the specific drawer where she keeps her jewelry, the way she liked her pillows to be slightly rumpled. And then, you enter her sanctuary and find it transformed into a museum of someone else's order. There is a specific kind of horror in a crime scene that is too clean. It suggests a killer who didn't just take a life, but stayed afterward. Someone who lingered in the room while the body was still warm, smoothing out the wrinkles in the fabric, perhaps humming to himself as he tucked the corners of the sheet. It suggests a predator who felt so safe, so invisible, that he could play the role of a grieving servant before slipping out into the night. The fragments of suspicion were there, scattered across the region like fallen leaves. A missing trinket here, a moved piece of furniture there. In one home, it might be 45,000 francs missing from a drawer after the gardener finished his work. In another, a childhood friend of Keller's would even try to whisper to the police that something was dark in Yvan's soul. But the whispers were caught in the wind. The landscape gardener continued to trim the hedges and prune the roses of the elderly. His green van a familiar and comforting sight in the driveways of those who lived alone. He was the man who kept the gardens beautiful, while inside the houses, he was waiting for the sun to go down. The families felt the unease, a cold draft in a room with all the windows closed. But for now, the law remained blind, and the pillow remained the silent, perfect weapon of a man who left no trace of his passage. The gendarmerie office in Mulhouse was a place where time seemed to settle like dust on a bookshelf. In the early years of the 2000s, the air inside was often thick with the scent of bitter chicory coffee, and the damp wool of coats hung near the radiators to dry. It was a space defined by the rhythmic clicking of keys on keyboards and the low, steady murmur of men discussing the mundane occurrences of the Alsace region. For many, these rooms represented a sanctuary of order, but for a few dedicated investigators, they were becoming a labyrinth of quiet, unsettling questions. They sat amidst stacks of manila folders, each one a record of a life ended, usually summarized in a few brief, clinical sentences. Most of these files were closed almost as soon as they were opened, marked with the stamp of natural causes. It is the way of the world that the elderly pass away in the stillness of the night, their hearts simply deciding that they have beat enough. In a region where the winters are long and the stone houses hold the cold, a death in bed is rarely viewed as a crime scene. It is viewed as a mercy, or at the very least, an inevitability. But the persistence of the gendarmerie is a slow and heavy thing, like the flow of a deep river. It began with a few men who had a talent for noticing the gaps between the words. They started to look at the maps of the Haut-Rhine and the Basse-Rhine, not as geography, but as a series of points on a grid. They noticed a statistical whisper, a frequency of loss in specific neighborhoods that felt slightly too high, slightly too rhythmic. When an 86-year-old woman passes in her sleep, no one calls for a forensic team. The doctor arrives, notes the absence of a struggle, and signs the certificate. It is a quiet ceremony of closure. However, as the investigators leaned over their wooden desks, tracing lines with their fingers, they saw that these quiet ceremonies were happening with a strange geographic precision. They were like shadows cast by a single, moving object. There was no blood, no broken glass, and no forced locks. There was only the silence of the rooms and the fact that, in many of these cases, the victims were found in positions that felt almost too composed, as if they had been staged for a final portrait. The skepticism they faced from their superiors was as heavy as the stone walls of the station. To suggest a serial killer was at work was to suggest that a phantom was moving through the villages of France, entering locked homes and leaving no trace of his presence. Without a body showing signs of violence, the legal system is a difficult machine to start. The investigators spoke of the anomaly of the bedsheets. They spoke of Marie Winterholer in January of 1994, and then Ernestine Mang just 2 months later. They pointed to the detail that had haunted the families. The beds were made with a perfection that the victims themselves could not have achieved. In the case of Ernestine, her son had found a heavy butter churn moved from the cellar to behind the front door. It was a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet it screamed of an intruder's presence. The investigators argued that these were not just deaths, they were signatures. They described the well-made bed as a calling card of a monster who took the time to tuck his victims in after he had stolen their breath. But to the bureaucratic eye, a neat bed is not evidence of a murder. It is simply a neat bed. The struggle to open a formal inquiry was a test of patience that lasted years. The investigators had to contend with the fact that their suspect left no DNA, no fingerprints, and used no weapon that left a mark. They were chasing a ghost who used a pillow as a tool and a landscaper's knowledge of the terrain to vanish into the shadows. They began to collect the stories of the families, the ones who mentioned a missing bank card, a vanished key, or a piece of jewelry that should have been on the nightstand. These fragments were scattered across different jurisdictions, filed away in different drawers, never intended to be read together. The persistence required was a form of meditation. It meant sitting in the silence of the archive rooms, listening to the hum of the overhead lights, and believing in the validity of a hunch when everyone else saw only the natural cycle of life. They felt the weight of the invisible killer, a man who was perhaps at that very moment walking through a garden in Mulhouse, clipping hedges and watching the windows of an elderly woman who lived alone. They looked at the lifestyle of a man named Yvan Keller, though at the time, he was just one name among many on a list of local laborers. They wondered how a simple gardener could afford the luxuries he seemed to enjoy, the trips to the casinos and the fine restaurants. The gap between his income and his expenses was another anomaly, another thread in the tapestry they were weaving. Every time a new report of a peaceful death reached their desks, a cold chill would settle in the room. They would look at each other, the same unspoken thought passing between them. Was this another one? They began to push for autopsies that had never been performed, for exhumations that were painful to request. They were fighting against the very human desire to believe that the world is safe and that the elderly die because it is their time. They were insisting that a predator was among them, one who understood that the best way to hide a crime is to make it look like a natural conclusion. The persistence of the gendarmerie was finally beginning to sharpen into a spear, a slow-moving but inevitable force that refused to let the silence of the victims remain unchallenged. The morning mist in the Alsace region often clings to the soil with a heavy, damp persistence, much like the secrets held by the man who tended its gardens. In the quiet streets of Mulhouse, specifically near the verdant stretches of Rue de Verdun, the rhythmic sound of a small van's engine would signal the arrival of a company known as Alsa Jardin. This was the professional identity of Yvan Keller, a man who had spent the better part of the late 20th century cultivating a reputation for meticulous care and quiet reliability. To his neighbors and his many satisfied clients, he was simply the gardener, the helpful, soft-spoken man who could coax life from the cold earth and keep the sprawling hedges of the local mansions in perfect, geometric order. He was a figure who moved with the seasons, appearing when the first buds of spring required pruning and returning, as the autumn leaves began their slow, golden descent toward the pavement. Imagine the texture of his world. It was a world of coarse burlap sacks, the sharp, metallic scent of garden shears, and the fine, dark grit of potting soil that lodged itself beneath his fingernails. Yvan was born in December of 1960 in the industrial town of Wittenheim, the youngest of 9 children in a family of basket makers. His early years were defined by hard, physical labor, forced upon him by a father who demanded every ounce of strength the boy possessed. This childhood of toil and struggle forged a man who understood the value of appearing industrious. When he was released from prison in August of 1989, after serving time for a robbery committed in his youth, he did not return to a life of obvious crime. Instead, he reached for the shovel and the rake. He built a facade of sweat and service, a mask of the humble laborer that was so convincing, it became his greatest weapon. A gardener is a ghost in a neighborhood. He is someone we see, but do not truly notice, a background character in the theater of the suburbs. As Yvan worked, his eyes were never just on the flower beds. While his hands moved with practiced ease across the hydrangeas and the roses, his mind was mapping the architecture of vulnerability. He observed the habits of the elderly women who lived alone in those grand, silent houses. He noted which windows were left slightly ajar to catch a summer breeze, and which back doors had latches that were more ornamental than secure. He listened to the chime of their hall clocks and the slow, heavy gait of their footsteps as they brought him a glass of water or a small tip for a job well done. He was a master of the polite conversation, the kind that feels warm but reveals nothing of the speaker. He would nod sympathetically as they spoke of their lonely afternoons or their growing frailty, all while noting the weight of the silver on their sideboards and the sparkle of the antique rings on their thin, translucent fingers. This was his scouting routine, a slow-motion hunt conducted under the bright, deceptive sun of the French countryside. There is a profound irony in the beauty Yvan Keller created. The gardens of Mulhouse flourished under his touch. He understood the delicate chemistry of the earth and the way light filtered through the canopy of ancient oaks. He was known to be affectionate with animals, often pausing his work to stroke a neighborhood cat or watch a bird return to its nest. This gentleness was not a lie, but rather one half of a fractured soul. To the world, he was the man who kept the chaos of nature at bay, the one who brought order to the overgrown corners of the estate. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the long shadows of the Vosges mountains stretched across the valley, the gardener's tools were packed away, and a different set of skills took over. The same hands that had carefully deadheaded a geranium would soon be used to smooth a pillow with terrifying, clinical precision. He lived a double life that was funded by the very people who praised his work. a cycle of creation by day and silent, suffocating destruction by night. Despite his modest appearance, Yvan harbored a hidden thirst for luxury that his gardening business could never truly quench. He was a man who loved the high-stakes tension of the casino, the adrenaline of the horse races, and the refined atmosphere of expensive restaurants. He moved between these worlds with a chilling ease. In the morning, he might be seen eating a simple crust of bread on a park bench, his clothes stained with the green juice of mown grass. By evening, he was a different creature entirely, spending the proceeds of a stolen heirloom on a vintage wine in a neighboring city. This constant need for capital drove his routine into a frenzy of efficiency. Between 1989 and 2006, his shadow fell across dozens, perhaps even hundreds of thresholds. He claimed, in the end, to have taken the lives of 150 people, though the authorities would eventually link him to a smaller, yet still staggering, number of victims. Each one was chosen because they had trusted the man with the shears, the man who knew exactly how to make their world look perfect. The sheer patience of his method is what allowed him to remain invisible for so long. He did not break windows or force locks with a crowbar. He entered as if he belonged there, often using keys he had duplicated or simply walking through doors left unlocked by those who felt safe in his presence. Once inside, he would navigate the darkened hallways with the same familiarity he used to navigate their gardens. He knew where the floorboards creaked and where the light from the street lamp would hit the carpet. His signature was not a wound or a struggle, but a bed remade with such obsessive neatness that it looked as though the victim had simply drifted off into a peaceful, permanent sleep. This was the gardener's final touch, the ultimate act of tidying up. He treated a crime scene like a flower bed, removing the evidence of his presence as if he were pulling weeds from the soil, leaving behind a silence so profound that it would take years for the world to realize that a predator had been hiding in the greenery all along. The border where France, Germany, and Switzerland meet is a place defined by the slow, rhythmic movement of the Rhine. At night, the water looks like liquid obsidian, reflecting the orange glow of industrial lamps and the distant, flickering lights of towns that bleed into one another. There is a specific sound to this place: the low hum of long-distance trucks, the occasional whistle of a cargo train, and the constant, soft rushing of the river against the stone pilings of the bridges. For decades, the people living here crossed these invisible lines for work, for shopping, or for a Sunday drive, barely noticing the transition from one language to another. But in the late summer of 2006, as the investigation into Yvan Keller began to breathe, the police realized that these borders had served as a veil for a darkness that was far more expansive than anyone had dared to imagine. Picture a map spread out on a heavy oak table in a quiet precinct in Mulhouse. The investigators took a compass and placed its sharp point on the city of Mulhouse, drawing a circle with a radius of 40 miles. When the ink dried, the circle did not respect the sovereignty of France. It swept east across the Rhine into the dense, pine-scented forests of Germany's Black Forest region. It dipped south into the pristine, quiet suburbs of Basel, Switzerland. The realization was a heavy, cold weight in the room. They had been looking for a local predator, a man who haunted the streets of Alsace. Now they were looking at a ghost who moved through 3 different nations with the ease of a seasonal breeze. The killer did not see borders. He only saw vulnerability, and the elderly women who lived alone in those quiet border towns had no idea that a monster was commuting across international lines to reach their bedside. In Switzerland, the investigation entered a world of profound silence. The Swiss authorities began to look back through their archives, pulling files on elderly women who had passed away in their sleep, seemingly from natural causes. In the shadow of the mountains, where life is often measured by the steady ticking of a clock, death is expected to be orderly. When an 80-year-old woman was found in a bed that was made with surgical precision, her hands folded neatly over a floral duvet. The local doctors rarely suspected foul play. They saw a peaceful end. They saw a heart that had simply grown tired of beating. But as the French investigators shared their findings, the Swiss police began to notice a pattern in the stillness. They looked at the photographs of the bedrooms, the dust-free nightstands, the pillows fluffed to an unnatural height, the missing trinkets that were too small to be missed by anyone but a grieving heir. The predator had been there, in the clean air of Basel, moving through the streets like a shadow in a gardener's uniform. Then the trail turned toward Germany. The investigators traveled north and east, crossing the river where the fog clings to the trees until mid-morning. In the German villages, the houses are often sturdy, with heavy wooden shutters and gardens that are tended with meticulous care. This was Yvan Keller's perfect camouflage. He was a man of the earth, a landscaper who understood the rhythm of the seasons. He knew when the hedges needed trimming and when the old women would be sitting alone on their porches, watching the light fade. To the German neighbors, he was just another worker, a man with calloused hands and a quiet disposition who moved from house to house. They did not notice the way he studied the locks. They did not notice the way he lingered near the windows as the sun began to set. The German police, working alongside their French counterparts, began to realize that their own records of natural deaths among the elderly were a graveyard of missed opportunities. The trail was long, winding through the rolling hills and the industrial outskirts, marked only by the absence of a few gold coins or a silver spoon. The tragedy of this cross-border spree lay in the fragmentation of the law. In those years, the police in France did not regularly compare their natural death statistics with the police in Freiburg or Zurich. Each jurisdiction was its own island, and Yvan Keller knew how to swim between them. He understood that if he killed in Mulhouse on a Tuesday and in a Swiss village on a Friday, no one would connect the dots. The paperwork lived in different languages, stored in different filing cabinets, beneath different flags. In the interrogation room back in France, as Keller began to speak in a low, gravelly voice, he mocked the boundaries that humans had created. To him, the borders were merely gates that he could walk through while carrying a pillow in a plastic bag. He spoke of 150 victims, a number so vast it felt like a hallucination. But as the leads poured in from across the Rhine, the investigators felt the sickening truth settle in. The map was becoming crowded with tiny, invisible marks of tragedy. As the sun rose over the three countries, the scale of the hunt changed. It was no longer a local matter. It was a continental reckoning. The investigators spent long nights drinking bitter coffee, staring at the blurred lines of the border on their computer screens. They thought about the miles Keller had driven in his old car, the thousands of hours he had spent crossing and recrossing the bridges, the wind rushing through his open window. He had lived a life of constant motion, a traveler whose only destination was the bedroom of a stranger. The air in the evidence room felt thin, heavy with the weight of 3 nations' worth of grief. They were chasing a man who had turned the peaceful geography of Europe into his own private hunting ground, leaving behind nothing but perfectly made beds and the silence of a heart that had been forced to stop. The trail across the borders was not made of footprints, but of the quiet, terrible absence of a struggle. The air in the forensic suite in Mulhouse always felt a few degrees cooler than the world outside. It was a sterile, unforgiving cold that seemed to cling to the plastic folders and the steel tables. For the investigators, the horror of the case involving Yvan Keller was not found in a bloody scene or a shattered window. Instead, the horror lay in the absolute, crushing silence of the evidence. There was a profound weight to what they could not see. As they pulled files from the late 1980s and the early 1990s, they weren't looking for fingerprints or DNA. They were looking for the absence of a struggle. They were searching for the ghosts of women who had been told they died of old age, only to have that narrative challenged by the chilling confessions of a man who claimed to be a ghost himself. Each folder represented a life that had ended in a quiet room, behind a locked door, with nothing left behind but a perfectly made bed and a heart that had simply stopped beating. To understand the forensic challenge of Yvan Keller, one must understand the terrible fragility of the human body in its twilight years. In a younger victim, the act of smothering is a violent, chaotic event. The body fights back. Muscles strain, skin bruises, and the tiny blood vessels in the eyes often burst under the pressure, leaving telltale red spots known as petechiae. But in the elderly, the biology of death is different. Their skin is as thin as parchment, and their breathing is often already shallow. When Keller pressed a pillow over a face or used his hands to pinch a nose shut, there was frequently no fight left to give. The heart, already weary from 8 or 9 decades of labor, would simply cease. To a local doctor called to a home in the middle of the night, it looked like a natural conclusion. There were no bruises, no broken bones, and no signs of a break-in. It was a biological blur where murder and nature looked identical under the dim light of a bedside lamp. This was the killer's greatest weapon, the assumption of peace. Keller was nicknamed the Cuckoo because of the way he entered these private nests, but he was also a master of domestic restoration. After the life had left his victim, he did something that haunted the detectives more than the act itself. He remade the beds. He would smooth the heavy down blankets, tuck the linen sheets tightly under the mattress, and fluff the pillows until the room looked as though it had never been disturbed. He moved through these homes with the quiet efficiency of a gardener tending to a winter bed. In one instance, a son noticed a heavy butter churn had been moved from the cellar to the hallway, a task his elderly mother could never have managed. But such details were easily dismissed as the eccentricities of the aged. The investigators realized that, for 15 years, they had been looking at crime scenes that had been curated into shrines of natural passing. The psychological toll on the task force began to manifest in the late nights spent over cold coffee and yellowing death certificates. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you have been blind. The detectives had to reckon with the fact that they might have issued burial permits for dozens, perhaps even 150 victims. Every natural death in the region suddenly became a potential crime. They began to question their own memories and the competence of the medical examiners who had signed those papers years ago. They felt the weight of the unseen victims pressing down on them, a silent gallery of faces that had been tucked away into the earth without justice. The uncertainty was like a slow-acting poison. It eroded their confidence and filled their sleep with images of shadows moving through gardens, climbing through windows, and standing over beds while the rest of the world slept in blissful, ignorant peace. They traced his path across the borders of France, Switzerland, and Germany, finding that the pattern remained disturbingly consistent. In every jurisdiction, the forensic story was the same. A lack of evidence was the evidence. The investigators had to become philosophers of the void. They had to learn how to read the subtle language of a house that had been slightly too well cleaned or a bank card that had been used in a city miles away from a woman who supposedly died in her sleep. The weight of the unseen was not just a metaphorical burden. It was a physical reality in the stacks of archives that grew higher every day. They were chasing a man who had turned the act of killing into a vanishing act. As the sun set over the Rhine, the detectives knew they were no longer just solving murders. They were attempting to reclaim the truth from a sea of carefully constructed lies, hoping that somewhere in the silence, a single overlooked detail would finally speak. As they moved into the final stages of the forensic review, the team began to focus on the psychological profile of a man who could sustain such a charade for over 20 years. Keller did not just kill. He stole the dignity of a natural ending. He replaced a family's grief with a hidden violation that would only be discovered decades later. The detectives found themselves staring at the photographs of the victims, looking for some spark of recognition, some plea for help that they had missed in the first pass. The weight of the unseen had transformed the investigation into a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey into the darkest corners of the domestic experience, where the person meant to protect the garden was the one who brought the frost. They were now certain that the number of 23 proven victims was only the surface of a much deeper, darker lake. The shadows were lengthening, and the true scale of the weight of the unseen was only just beginning to reveal its terrifying dimensions. The investigation into the quiet deaths of the Alsace region had become a ghost itself. For years, the files sat in the police archives in Mulhouse, gathering a fine gray dust that seemed to mirror the ash of the lives they documented. Each folder represented an elderly woman found in her bed, her sheets smoothed with impossible precision, her heart simply having ceased to beat. There was no blood, no forced locks, and no sign of a struggle. To the world, these were natural endings, the inevitable fading of the very old. But within the quiet hallways of the station, a few detectives kept the light on late into the night, staring at the maps of the region. They were looking for a ghost who left no footprints, only a lingering sense of order that felt entirely too perfect. The air in those offices always felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, tiring persistence. It was the mid-2000s, and the silence was about to be broken by a voice that had finally grown tired of carrying a secret. It was not the first time a name had been whispered in connection to these tragedies. In 1993 and again, later that decade, small ripples had disturbed the surface of the water, but each time the trail had gone cold. Then came the third tip. This was not a loud, dramatic confession in a crowded room, but a steady stream of information that began to flow toward the investigators in 2003. It was a denunciation, a heavy word that carried the weight of betrayal and relief. The informant spoke of a man who moved through the gardens of the elderly, a man who knew the rhythms of their homes and the fragility of their locks. This tip did not just provide a name. It provided a bridge between the world of legitimate labor and the world of predatory shadows. The detectives listened as the voice on the other end of the line described the way Yvan Keller operated. They heard about his dual life as a skilled landscaper and a man who studied the vulnerabilities of those he served. The clock on the wall of the interrogation room seemed to tick louder with every detail shared, marking the moment the phantom finally took on a physical form. The information pointed specifically toward the way the dead were found. The informant spoke of pillows and the meticulous rearranging of bedding, a detail that chilled the detectives to their very core. They began to revisit the case of Ernestine Mang from 1994. They remembered the heavy butter churn that had been moved from the cellar to the hallway, a task an 86-year-old woman with failing hips could never have accomplished. They thought of Augusta Wasmer, whose daughter had insisted the bed was made too well, far better than her mother would have ever managed in her final hours. As the detectives sifted through these memories, the tip acted as a lens, sharpening the blurred edges of the past. The landscape of Alsace, with its rolling hills and quiet villages, began to look different. Every garden Yvan Keller had tended became a potential map of a crime. The smell of freshly cut grass and the sight of neatly trimmed hedges suddenly felt like a mask, a beautiful facade hiding the cold calculations of a man who was now, for the first time, being watched from the shadows. For 3 long years, from 2003 to 2006, the police moved with the deliberate patience of a predator. They could not afford to rush. They were dealing with a man who had mastered the art of being invisible. They followed the money, tracing the small, precious items that had vanished from the homes of the deceased. They looked into the antique shops and the junk dealers where Keller had traded his stolen treasures for the funds to fuel his gambling and his taste for luxury. The detectives spent countless hours in unmarked cars, watching him work in the gardens of Mulhouse. They watched the way he handled his tools, with a precision that was both admirable and terrifying. They saw the way he interacted with his neighbors, always polite, always helpful, the kind of man who would rescue a stray animal or offer a warm greeting. It was a psychological puzzle where the pieces refused to fit together, a helpful gardener on one side and a cold-blooded intruder on the other. The tension in the investigation was like a piano wire stretched to its limit, vibrating with the silent energy of a coming storm. By September of 2006, the net was finally ready to be cast. The 3-year investigation, sparked by that singular, persistent tip, had reached its crescendo. The detectives had built a narrative out of silence, connecting dozens of deaths that had once been dismissed as the natural course of time. They realized that Yvan Keller was not just a thief. He was a master of the final exit, a man who used the intimacy of a pillow to steal the very breath from those who trusted him. The atmosphere in the station changed as the arrest warrant was prepared. There was no celebratory mood, only a somber realization of the sheer scale of the tragedy they were uncovering. They were preparing to confront a man who, when eventually faced with the evidence, would claim a number of victims so high it defied belief. As the sun set over the rooftops of Mulhouse, casting long, orange shadows across the pavement, the officers moved out. They were no longer chasing a ghost. They were going to meet a man who had made a career out of the quietest of crimes, a man whose mask was finally about to fall. The tip had changed everything. It had turned a series of unrelated tragedies into a single, terrifying story. It had given a voice to the women who could no longer speak for themselves. As the police vehicles glided through the streets, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The gardens were still, the houses were dark, and the pillows were soft. The long wait was ending. The truth, heavy and cold, was finally coming home to rest. The details of the arrest would soon become the focus of a nation, but in this moment, there was only the slow, rhythmic pulse of justice finally catching its breath in the dark. The journey from a whispered denunciation to a prison cell was almost complete, and the shadows of Alsace were about to give up their most well-kept secret. The transition from a cold case file to a living, breathing shadow is a heavy weight for any investigator to carry. For 3 long years, the authorities had moved through the archives like ghosts themselves, trying to find the connective tissue between dozens of quiet deaths. But in the late summer of 2006, the air changed. The investigation moved out of the cramped, paper-filled rooms of the precinct and into the damp, morning air of the Alsace region. The team of investigators began a delicate dance of surveillance, an operation that required them to become as invisible as the man they were hunting. They settled into unmarked vehicles, parked on quiet corners in Mulhouse, their eyes fixed on a man who seemed, to any casual observer, entirely unremarkable. This was Yvan Keller, a man who had built his life on the foundation of being unnoticed, a man whose very existence was a masterclass in blending into the scenery of everyday life. The mist in the French countryside during those September mornings was thick and clinging, a gray veil that draped over the vineyards and the suburban streets. It was the perfect cover for both the hunter and the hunted. From their vantage points, the officers watched as Keller emerged from his home. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a laborer, a man of the earth. As a landscape gardener, his movements were naturally tied to the outdoors. He carried the tools of his trade with a practiced ease, shovels, rakes, and shears that clattered softly in the back of his vehicle. To the neighbors, he was the helpful man from the gardening company known as Alsa Jardin. They saw a man who cared for their lawns and trimmed their hedges. But through the long-range lenses of the police cameras, a different story was being written. The way he moved was not just about work. It was about observation. He was scouting, his eyes constantly drifting toward the windows of the houses he passed, lingering just a second too long on the latches of a garden gate or the height of a porch step. There is a specific kind of patience required for a serial killer, a stillness that mirrors the very animals they resemble. Keller was often compared to a cuckoo bird, a creature that does not build its own nest, but instead waits for the perfect moment to slip into the home of another. The surveillance teams documented this instinct with growing dread. They watched him sit in his car for hours, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on a single residence. He wasn't looking at the architecture or the flowers he was hired to tend. He was timing the lives inside. He was learning when the morning light hit the kitchen window, when the mail arrived, and most importantly, when the elderly residents were most vulnerable. He watched the rhythmic opening and closing of shutters, a domestic heartbeat that he intended to stop. The police recorded every stop, every turn of his head, mapping out a predatory geography that stretched across the borders of France, Switzerland, and Germany. Inside the surveillance van, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that words can barely capture. The officers lived in a state of constant, low-level vibration, their pulses quickening every time Keller turned down a new street. They had to stay close enough to see his eyes, but far enough away that he wouldn't feel the heat of their gaze. Keller was a man of the woods, a man who had grown up in the harsh, unstable environment of a large family where survival was a daily struggle. He had a sixth sense for being watched. The investigators described the way he would occasionally stop, standing perfectly still in the middle of a sidewalk, as if listening to the wind. In those moments, the world seemed to hold its breath. The police would look away, pretending to be busy with maps or radios, praying that the thin thread of their operation wouldn't snap. It was a psychological war of nerves, played out in the mundane settings of grocery store parking lots and quiet residential cul-de-sacs. What chilled the investigators the most was the sheer precision of his routine. He was a man of habit, but his habits were designed to facilitate horror. He would return to the same neighborhoods over and over, circling them like a hawk on a thermal. He knew which houses belonged to women living alone. He knew who was frail and who was strong. During the surveillance, the police began to realize that Keller wasn't just looking for wealth. He was looking for ease. He was looking for the path of least resistance. He would walk along the perimeter of a property, his hands in his pockets, appearing to be admiring a hedge or a flower bed, but he was actually checking for the strength of a window frame or the height of a fence. He was a master of the mundane detail, the kind of man who noticed a loose brick or a hidden key under a stone. To watch him was to watch a master thief of lives, refining his technique with every silent walk through the mist. As the days stretched into weeks, the surveillance logs grew into a mountain of evidence. They documented his interactions with his family, his quiet evenings, and his sudden, nocturnal departures. There was a duality to him that was profoundly disturbing. In the daylight, he was a husband and a worker. In the shadows, he was a silent intruder. The police watched as he drove through the night, sometimes covering hundreds of kilometers, crossing into Germany or Switzerland before returning home by dawn. They saw the fatigue in his eyes, but also a strange, driven energy that seemed to propel him forward. They were watching a man who had potentially claimed more lives than any other in the history of his country, and yet he still stopped to buy a newspaper or share a kind word with a neighbor's dog. This was the true terror of the surveillance, the realization that the monster was not hiding in the woods, but was standing right there, in the open, smiling through the mist. The late summer air in Mulhouse was thick with the scent of maturing trees and the cooling stone of ancient buildings. It was September 20th, 2006, a night when the humidity seemed to hold its breath. For weeks, the surveillance teams had watched the man known as Yvan Keller, observing his rhythms as a landscape gardener, a man whose hands were often stained with the soil of the earth he tended. The transition from observation to action was a silent, mechanical process. The warrants were signed, and the shadows of the police force began to lengthen across the pavement of Rue de Verdun. There was no wind that night, only the distant, rhythmic hum of the city fading into its midnight slumber. The world was quiet, but for the investigators, the silence was charged with the electricity of a long-awaited resolution. The convoy of dark, unmarked vehicles moved through the streets like a slow-moving river of ink. They eventually slowed to a halt outside the number 87. This was a house that did not demand attention, a gray facade that blended into the twilight, adorned with iron-wrought balconies that looked like frozen vines in the dim streetlight. To the neighbors, this was the home of a Monsieur Tautlemond, a man who was helpful, perhaps a bit ordinary, someone who lived a quiet life with his partner. But as the officers stepped out into the damp air, the reality of the situation felt heavy and cold. The boots of the tactical teams made no sound on the pavement as they surrounded the perimeter, their movements deliberate and practiced. The streetlights cast long, amber shadows that danced against the stone walls, creating a sense of suspended time. Then came the knock. It was not the tentative tapping of a visitor, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of authority hitting the wood of the door. Inside the apartment, the silence was shattered. When Yvan Keller appeared, he did not look like a monster or a ghost. He looked like a man who had been expecting this visitor for a very long time. There was an eerie stillness in his expression, a lack of surprise that unsettled those who stood before him. As the metal of the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound seemed to resonate through the narrow hallway, a sharp, mechanical finality. He was led out into the cool night, his gaze fixed forward, past the flashlights and the hushed whispers of the neighborhood waking up to the spectacle. The landscape gardener was no longer tending to his plants. He was now a captive of the state. The journey to the police station in Mulhouse was a blur of blue and red lights reflecting off the windows of the patrol car. Inside the station, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the organic darkness of the street. The air was sterile, smelling of industrial floor wax and the metallic tang of old coffee. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead with a high-pitched buzz that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. In the processing area, the officers moved with a frantic efficiency, their voices hushed but urgent. Keller was placed in a small holding area, a space where the walls were a pale, sickly green and the floor was cold, gray concrete. The sound of heavy doors slamming and the jingle of keys created a percussive rhythm that marked the beginning of his 48-hour journey through the legal system and the weight of his own history. While Keller sat in the sterile silence of the station, a different kind of activity was unfolding back at Rue de Verdun. Forensic teams, dressed in white suits that glowed under their powerful lamps, began the meticulous task of dismantling a life. They moved through the rooms with surgical precision, sifting through the mundane artifacts of a domestic existence. It was in the corners of this home that the first cracks in the gardener's facade appeared. Tucked away amongst the ordinary were items that did not belong, glimmering gemstones that caught the artificial light, and Alsatian paintings that spoke of lives far more affluent than his own. These were the trophies of a shadow life, the physical remnants of houses he had entered under the cover of darkness. Each object was tagged and bagged, a silent witness to a crime that had remained hidden for decades. The search extended into the garden, the place where Keller felt most at home. Under the beams of the investigators' torches, the greenery took on a sinister hue. They examined the tools, the shears, the trowels, and the heavy boots still caked with the soil of his last job. There was a profound irony in the way he had nurtured life in the gardens of others, while allegedly snuffing it out in their bedrooms. The investigators moved through the damp grass, their breath visible in the cooling air. They looked for disturbed earth, for anything that might have been buried beneath the petunias and the hedges. The sensory experience of the search was overwhelming. The smell of wet earth and crushed leaves mixed with the sharp scent of chemical reagents. Every leaf that rustled in the breeze felt like a whisper of a secret trying to escape into the night. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the initial search was drawing to a close. Back at the station, Yvan Keller sat motionless, a figure of stone in a room of shadows. The transition from a free man to a prisoner was complete, but the weight of the discoveries made at his home was only beginning to settle. The investigation had finally breached the walls of his sanctuary, exposing the duality of a man who could both beautify the world and haunt its quietest hours. The files were thickening, the evidence was mounting, and the atmosphere remained tense with the realization of the scale of the tragedy they were uncovering. The night was over, but the darkness was far from gone. The process was slow, a deliberate unraveling of a life built on secrets and silent entries. Outside, the city of Malouse stirred into a day that would never feel quite as safe again. The interrogation room was a landscape of harsh angles and soft shadows, a place where time seemed to fold. The walls, painted a weary shade of eggshell, bore the invisible marks of 1,000 desperate conversations. A single fluorescent light tube flickered overhead, casting a rhythmic pulse across the floor. It hummed with a low frequency, a sound that vibrated deep within the marrow of one's bones. In the center of this small world, Yvan Keller sat perfectly still. He simply existed in the silence, appearing at peace while the world around him fractured under the weight of his dark presence. His hands were the hands of a gardener, large, calloused, and stained with the ghosts of the earth. He kept them rested on the laminate table, palms down, as if he were trying to steady the floor. The detectives watched the way the shadow of his heavy brow fell over his eyes, masking any flicker of emotion. He smelled faintly of stale tobacco and the cold, damp scent of the outdoors. There was a terrifying calm in his posture, the stillness of a predator waiting. He looked as though he were merely passing time in a bus station, rather than a cell. The questioning had been going on for hours, a slow dance of pressure and release. For a long time, Keller had denied everything, his voice a steady, emotionless drone. But then something shifted. It was subtle, a slight tilt of the head, a softening of his shoulders. He looked at the men across from him with a strange sort of pity, as if he were about to explain a complex formula to children. He leaned forward, the chair beneath him letting out a sharp, metallic groan. He took a slow breath, and finally, the first terrible truth began to emerge. Then the words began to flow. He didn't start with a plea for mercy. Instead, he started with a number, 150. The detectives froze, their pens hovering over yellow pads, 150 souls. He spoke the number with a chilling detachment, as if he were counting sacks of grain. He began to list them by the houses they lived in and the items on their nightstands. He traced a trail of death that stretched across France, Switzerland, and Germany, covering nearly 2 decades of quiet violence that had baffled the authorities for so many long years. He spoke of the pillows. This was his chosen instrument, a mundane object of comfort turned into a tool of finality. He described moving through the darkness like a shadow. He called himself a cuckoo, a bird that makes its home in the nests of others. With a terrifying gentleness, he explained how he would press the fabric over their faces until the struggle ceased. Afterward, he would meticulously remake the beds, smoothing out every wrinkle. He wanted them to look natural, ensuring the world saw only a quiet, peaceful end to a long, well-lived life in the pale, soft morning light. As he talked, he revealed the hollow core of his motivation. It was, quite simply, for the money. He needed the gold and the cash to fund a lifestyle he felt he deserved. He spoke of the casinos, the bright lights of the machines, and the rush of the horse races. He described the luxury hotels where he would spend the proceeds of a life taken, eating fine meals while families were still mourning. The contrast was sickening. The ultimate price paid by a victim in a quiet village, all so he could sit at a velvet-covered table and gamble for his amusement. The room felt smaller now, the shadows stretching longer as the sun dipped. Keller's voice never wavered. He didn't show a spark of anger or a shred of remorse. He described his actions as a form of work, a repetitive task he had perfected. To him, the people he killed were obstacles between him and the wealth he craved. He spoke of the cleansing of the rooms, the way he left them neater than he found them. The detectives realized they were in the presence of a man who had turned murder into a quiet, domestic, and highly profitable routine. When he finally stopped, a suffocating silence returned. The confession was recorded, a ribbon of tape capturing the admission of 150 stolen breaths. Keller looked at his hands as if the conversation were over. The detectives gathered their papers, their movements heavy. They stepped out into the hallway, leaving the man alone in the humming dark. The weight of his words remained behind, a cold, invisible fog that would never truly lift from that room. The investigation had ended, but the true horror of the Cuckoo Killer was only just beginning to settle in their heavy hearts. The air in the basement of the Malouse High Court was heavy, thick with the scent of old stone and the metallic tang of cooling radiators. It was the night of September 21st, drifting into the early hours of September 22nd, 2006. Yvan Keller sat in the sterile dimness of his holding cell, a space that felt far too small to contain the enormity of the secrets he had just exhaled. For hours, the air in the interrogation rooms above had been filled with the names of the forgotten. He had spoken of 150 souls, a number so vast it seemed to vibrate against the concrete walls. Each confession was a stone added to a mountain of grief. Inside the cell, the silence was the suffocating weight of a final curtain. Keller looked up at the ceiling, where a single neon light fixture flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing hum. This was the man the papers were already beginning to call the killer of the century, yet here he was, reduced to the gray shadows of a courthouse basement. He knew the mechanics of the law were beginning to grind. The judges, the lawyers, and the grieving families were all preparing for a trial that would span decades. They wanted answers for the 150. They wanted to know why he chose the pillows, why he tucked the blankets so neatly. But Keller had always been a man of his own design. In his mind, he had already provided the ending to his dark story. The laces were long, sturdy strands of fabric. In the stillness of the night, every movement seemed amplified. The friction of the lace against the eyelid of the shoe made a soft, rasping sound that echoed in the corners of the cell. He did not hurry. Time had a different texture in that basement. He began to intertwine the laces, braiding them together with the patience of a master craftsman. He was weaving a rope, a thin, fragile-looking thing that carried the weight of 1,000 dark nights. As he worked, perhaps he thought of the gardens he had tended in Malouse. He was creating his final exit, ensuring that the 150 secrets he carried would remain partially obscured. When the sun began to rise on September 22nd, 2006, the light did not reach the basement. It remained trapped in the upper floors where investigators were still sorting through the records of 23 confirmed victims and the shadow of many more. When the guards finally opened the heavy door to his cell, they were met with a sight that halted the progress of justice. Yvan Keller was gone. He had used the very things that connected him to the earth, his shoelaces, to leave it forever. On a small scrap of paper, or perhaps whispered to the cold walls before the end, were his final words. "I just wanted to be loved." It was a jarring sentiment. The silence that followed Keller's death was not a relief. It was a void. For the families of the women in Sausheim and across the borders into Switzerland and Germany, the news was a second theft. First, he had taken their mothers, and now he had taken their day in court. In 2015, the legal system would officially declare a non-lieu, a formal closing of the cases because the accused was no longer there to answer. The files were boxed away, the evidence rooms grew dusty, and the pillows were returned to empty houses. The mystery of exactly how many lives were taken remains a ghost that haunts the quiet villages. The shadow of the man lingers. As we look back at the trail he left behind, we see the tragic irony of his final silence. He sought a way to end the story on his own terms, leaving the world to piece together the fragments of a broken history. But tonight, that history does not have to be yours to carry. The valleys of Alsace are quiet now. The gardens are blooming under the silver moonlight, and the windows are locked tight against the chill of the evening. The names of the lost are whispered by the wind, but they are finally at peace. The long, winding road of this investigation has reached its final end. The heavy ledgers are closed, and the ink has dried on the final page. The secrets of Yvan Keller are buried forever. You can let the story go. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.